The biggest surprise of the season is not that Donald Trump is so crazed, but that so many people have joined grassroots resistance groups. First, there were those women's marches all over the place the day after the inauguration. Something like 5 million people marched that day in hundreds of cities and towns. Nothing like that had ever happened before. And more recently, members of Congress have faced thousands of angry constituents at dozens of town hall meetings. So much is going on, and so many groups are forming that it's hard to keep track. Later in this show, we'll focus on what seems to be the biggest of the new resistance groups, the one called Indivisible. But first, we turn to the nation's Joshua Holland. He's put together a guide to the landscape of grassroots resistance for The Nation magazine. He's a writing fellow at the Nation Institute and host of Politics and Reality Radio. Joshua Holland, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me, John.
So for this project, how many groups did you start with, and how many did you write about for the magazine?
Well, I started with a list of 75 groups. I narrowed it down for a piece for thenation.com, the online site, and I think I looked at 18 or 19 different groups, and we have an updated version of that piece in the magazine, and we narrowed it down to, I think, 8 or 9 in that piece.
And we have time to do, about 6 in this segment. So let's start with what seems to be the biggest and most successful, Indivisible. We'll be speaking with one of the Indivisible people a little later in the podcast, but we need you to tell us the basics. What is Indivisible? What's their strategy?
Well, Indivisible is a really interesting project in that it started with a handful of former and current Hill staffers, and they first set out with kind of a modest goal, which was that they were going to publish a guide that would help people understand how best to communicate with their elected officials, with their representatives on Capitol Hill. But then it became something else because what they saw, and I have to say, John, I heard this theme again and again talking to all of these different people who had started these new groups, is that they started something and then they were overwhelmed by the response to it. So they started out with publishing this basic guide, how to get in touch with your members of Congress. And immediately the Google Doc where they had hosted that crashed, and they started to get dozens and dozens of inquiries and people wanting to get more involved. So they added these indivisible groups, these local groups, and people came to them and said, I am going to organize something in my community and I need help. So what was started as kind of this guide to getting in touch with your members of Congress became a cluster of local grassroots groups, and I believe that they're up to over 5,000 of these groups nationwide. If I type in my zip code, I think I've had 6 of them within 30 miles of my place in the Hudson Valley in New York. So It really has exploded, and I think it's one of the things that's interesting about Indivisible is that they've taken some lessons from the Tea Party movement, and I don't think that we want to compare these new efforts with the Tea Partiers for a whole host of reasons. But as far as just looking at strategy, the Tea Partiers realized that they didn't have that Republicans in Washington did not have the power to set the agenda, that they realized early on that they could only react, and to do so at a local level, to turn out lots of people to get in contact with their representatives. And this is a model that I think Indivisible has adopted with zeal, and we're seeing a lot of these same kind of town hall actions that we saw from the Tea Partiers in 2009, 2010, we're seeing right now.
You survey a lot of organizations that I knew nothing about. One has the wonderful name Run for Something. What is Run for Something?
Run for Something is an organization dedicated to encouraging and recruiting and assisting young people to run for local office. And it was started by some former Clinton staffers. These are political pros. They identified a gap in the existing infrastructure, in that it was very hard for young people who have not maybe had some of the advantages of doing a White House internship or whatever to get the training that they needed and in some cases financial support that they need to run for office. So they're encouraging people to do that.
Another group that you report on is called Knock Every Door. What are they?
So when I approach these people, I always ask them, so what is the gap that you identified in, the existing political infrastructure out there that you sought to fill? And the folks that Knock Every Door, they realize that in a modern political campaign, in the traditional structure, it's very hard to get enough people to canvass to actually knock every door. They want to go and have face-to-face conversations in all districts, including districts that aren't competitive. So their idea is that instead of doing a kind of traditional canvassing operation where a campaign hires people to train other people to do canvassing, they are doing this in kind of a grassroots, bottom-up way where they give people the tools to reach out to their neighbors and to get other people to reach out to their neighbors, and they're basically trying to knock on every door in America and have a conversation with their neighbors. They understand that face-to-face persuasion is more effective than political ads and what candidates say in their stump speeches, and so they're trying to take the so-called 50-state strategy and up it to every single congressional district in the country, the 435 district strategy.
Swing left. Swing left made a lot of sense to me. Briefly tell us about Swing Left.
Their idea is that they would get people who are living in safe congressional districts to identify the closest swing district and go there and canvass in that district. So this is kind of about the inefficient distribution of Democrats. The idea is you have safe districts where there's an abundance of volunteers, and you have swing districts where it's a little harder to find people, and the idea is to kind of flood the zone with people from safe districts in nearby swing districts.
Now, what about coordination? Is it really a good idea to have 75 or 80 different groups doing similar things? Shouldn't these people work together? Shouldn't knock on every door, turn over their lists to the swing left people and so on?
There is a fair amount of coordination going on among these groups. A lot of this is, as I said, really just spontaneous. People furious about the election, figuring what can I do, and then doing something. And I would expect that, like any group of startups, you would have failures. I mean, not all of these efforts are going to take off, but you only need a few to be successful to really change the picture.
Another question about the whole spectrum here. Can you tell us whether all of these organizations or most of these organizations are committed to moving the Democratic Party to the left in the Bernie direction?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that most of the people that I spoke to would feel that they identify with that faction of the party, but some of them are filling in gaps in the Democratic infrastructure that aren't ideological in nature. So if you look at, for example, we talked about Run for Something. They're trying to get young people who are Democrats to run for local office. I don't believe that they're favoring, one ideological perspective over another one. There's one of the groups that I profiled is called Project 45. They're doing FOIA. They're using the Freedom of Information Act to dig info out of government agencies in the era of Trump. So they're probably not, pigeonholable in an ideological category.
How many of these organizations actually have real traction in red America, or is this all pretty much in the blue states?
Well, here's the thing. There are some of these groups are focused in swing states, including reddish states, but a lot of them acknowledge that there is this distributional problem between red and blue states and are seeking to even that playing field. So a group that didn't make it into the online piece is one called Adopt a State. They're basically raising money in blue states and sending it to red states. So there is a recognition that the Democratic Party has a lot of work to do in red states to rebuild the bench, if you will, and I think several of these groups are working on that.